So I'm Ainsley. I'm a former graduate student and RA in CMS. When I was in CMS, I was an RA for the ICE lab, which stands for Imagination, Computation, and Expression. And the PI for that lab is Fox Harrell. And when I was at MIT, I wrote a thesis called Staged Empathy that investigated how empathy and visual perception work together in immersive environments, and actually really looked at the kind of misconception that just being immersed automatically produces empathy, and instead try to look at what actual characteristics, interactions, and activities within immersive environments affected that process of empathizing. After that, I moved to the BuzzFeed Open Lab in San Francisco as part of their Open Lab fellowship program, where I delved into doing a lot of production stuff with reporters and journalists that ranged from 360 video to sort of laser scanned projects, as well as started working on Glossy, which was a very early prototype for some of the work that I'm going to talk about today. And what that was a tool for collaboration using voice in 3D space in WebVR. After that, I came back to MIT, where with Neil and Dennis and Chada, who's not here, we were applied to DesignX Fund here at MIT, which is out of the architecture school, to further develop some of that WebVR prototype, and in alignment with everyone else's research, to create this tool called Mediate VR, which is a tool for immersive computing. And then more recently, the Knight Challenge Fund for J360 awarded a bunch of grants for people making tools for reporters and journalists, and that was an opportunity to kind of see how this initial concept for Voxhop, for reporter collaboration, could be built out into a more coherent tool. And so one of the goals for me this year is to kind of meet with people who are working in this space, both in nonfiction VR and in documentary and actually in news, and kind of understand what their needs are as far as a tool for collaborative production goes in WebVR. Also, what types of barriers they have to entry in this space, what things are going to be solved for them, and what things can BoxHop potentially help so that they can start creating work more easily. Okay, so to start with, when I say interactive VR, I think, raise your hand here if you've tried out 360 video before. Cool, that's great. This is the first presentation I've given where everybody raised their hands, so I'm happy about that. A lot of times 360 is put in opposition to, quote, real VR. I don't think that's necessarily that useful, and I think it's more of a spectrum. But generally speaking, when I talk about interactive VR, what I mean is that the images are both in real-time 3D, meaning that they're rendered as the user goes through the experience, that they incorporate something called translational movement. You may have heard of like 6 degrees of freedom or things like that, but basically it means the ability to move back and forth in space and not just look around from a fixed perspective. And then, of course, sometimes people call it real VR, which I don't really think is that helpful. But it also is interesting to think about in comparison to something like a pre-rendered animation, which, while created out of CGI, is still just a 360 video. And you may see some of those too. And that's kind of what I mean. It's more of a spectrum rather than a one or the other type of thing. So sometimes I think it's useful to kind of go through the development, the production pipeline that many VR projects take. This is something that when I was at BuzzFeed, I found to be really prohibitive for production of interactive VR projects with reporters and journalists there. Partially that's just because this 4-stage process, and this is a simplification, does not really fit in with like the news cycle or with the timelines or with the budgets that people have for these types of projects. But generally speaking, you have the phase if you create your virtual world, and I'm not going to get into anything about story design here because that's fundamentally important, but like, you know, this is just sort of the technical aspects for now. You need to create your world, which you can use 3D modeling, reality capture, or, you know, in some apps you may be using a camera feed. You also have tools and software like 3D modeling software. For the story and interaction, you need something that can sort of build logic into the experience. That's something like Unity, Unreal, WebVR, and you can also, it requires the use of ARKit or ARCore if you're going to be building AR experiences, as well as, you know, a significantly more coding experience to program that interactivity for those existing tools. And then you have distribution, which is a huge barrier for reporters, at least it was last year, mostly because interactive VR is primarily supported reliably only in the Steam and Oculus store. and increasingly in the iOS and the Play Store. If you're working with WebVR, it's not very well supported, but lately you can use it in, I think, the production build of Firefox. And then finally, you have what the people using your VR experience need at the end of the day, and that's going to be, for interactive VR, pretty much a high-end Oculus or Vive, at least for the past year or so. You can also use things like the Gear or the Google Daydream, which are phone-based tools, to kind of approximate some of those experiences, and increasingly those are becoming even better. For example, the recent Pixel and like conferences at Google and Apple, they're both releasing, not Apple, yeah, Apple, they're both releasing technology that allows AR and 6 degrees of freedom in the phone. So that's just kind of the landscape where it is right now. And so, like I said, when I was at BuzzFeed, one of the challenges was thinking that like this interactive VR can do a lot of things that we don't necessarily have the ability to achieve in 360 video, but it has these problems. Number one, like the development timeline is incredibly long compared to the normal news cycle. A lot of the technical development is beyond the skill set of writers and web developers. It tends to not be a very collaborative process naturally, especially for non-technical people, because it's kind of this stepwise like story, development, production, because you don't have everybody involved in the whole steps of the process. It's also like most of the reporters that I worked with and editors tend to like just work in Google Docs constantly. So they're basically getting feedback from their first pitch to the end, and it's this constant iterative cycle until it's actually published, which is not really how, it doesn't come naturally for the development of interactive projects. And the big question of like why I would make a VR experience of this story is something that we never really got to answer at BuzzFeed because we didn't really get through the production stages. And I think stuff came up, like maybe this would be good for investigative, like a crime scene, or maybe this would be good for a mapping project, but nobody really took the next step to kind of be like, this is necessary for my story. And that's something that's still kind of an open question in all of the interactive space, I think. Cool. So when I came back to MIT, we began working on this project called Mediate VR. And Mediate VR is what we actually have a demo of up right there. And once we finish the presentation portion, maybe people can just check it out if they haven't seen it before. Mediate VR is built in Unity right now. And it's it has two components. One is something called Mediate Service, which allows you to kind of annotate a 3D environment using your voice, and then it transcribes those details and adds them to a database here for perusal by somebody who's not necessarily in VR. And so this was a much broader project, really thinking about what it would mean to user test in space, what it would mean for architects or designers, and we were kind of exploring those commercialization options for this technology. And then over the summer, we started also experimenting with building up an AI component for this tool. So we did a bunch of user studies at the engine in Central Square, where we had people navigate virtual environments and annotate them, basically describe them using natural language, using just their voice with that very little prompting or instruction. And so my collaborator Chada is working and leading the AI development of that process, and the hope will be that eventually we can create systems that describe the environments in natural human language. So that's kind of a totally separate component to what we're working on, as opposed to the front end, which is a tool for kind of annotation and collaboration in real time. But just kind of to give you a background on this kind of stuff that we've been doing in the range of it. So for Voxhop, the idea is, what do we need to add to the Mediate service to make it something that can actually be used almost out of the box for reporters and nonfiction writers? It's a tool for collaborative voice annotation of 3D spaces. Thus far, it's something that we imagine being useful on the production side as opposed to the distribution side, but that's an open question. It is incumbent to support WebVR, which is something that right now Mediate works in Unity, and we have a prototype for WebVR. And I think that one of the goals of this project is to really continue to create a production level version for WebVR. And the motivation for that is mostly that WebVR has the opportunity to reach a lot more people than you can reach through these sort of closed ecosystem Play Store and App Store environments. And one of the advantages of that is that for experimental projects and things for people who are testing out new ideas or kind of trying new interaction modalities or doing things with low resources, getting something approved for an app store can be really challenging because you may not meet the specs that they have for user interaction. You may not meet the quality control specs that they have. And for VR right now, those specs are tough because these companies, it's important for them that people have positive experiences in VR because they've sunk a ton of money into this ecosystem. So they're not very welcoming to apps that may not be that easy to use, or maybe sort of disturbing, or may be a little bit out of the box. And that's something that WebVR can be a real boon to, because you can use it in basically in any browser, in any device that has access to one of the current web browsers that supports it. So one of the most accessible ways that I think about BoxHop is kind of a tool for making a spatial podcast. And it's something that can support multiple users, and you can move through a space, both leave feedback, comments, and actual descriptions of what you'd like to see happen there or what happens in your story. One of the questions I don't have an answer for is, what are the tools that people would need in order to make experiences beyond Voxhop? Is it necessary for it to have a 3D image uploader, for example, or are people able to kind of put that in themselves? And I think that one of the things I'd like to do before we get into the meat of that discussion is kind of just paint a little bit of a picture of the coming soon landscape, because I think VR right now has a lot of flaws and a lot of barriers to entry that are really difficult for people to kind of get around. But one of the things I like to just point to is the increasing accessibility of resources, like through Tiltbrush and Quill, which are two programs released by Google and by Oculus that actually allow you to kind of create three-dimensional environments just through drawing, which brings basically the accessibility of creating 3D worlds to people who previously may have only been only worked as illustrators or as painters or other types of non-technical artists. And with it comes also the distribution platform. So it's now possible not just for you to go out and buy 3D models on a 3D model marketplace that's marketed towards people who do fabrication or things like that, of which there are many, or game design, or et cetera, but also kind of look for these more illustrative resources for people who are primarily artists, who maybe have made more creative environments. I like this one. I found it on the vr.google.com/sketches, which you can check out. And it's basically like this gas station that someone just built in Tiltbrush. And it's pretty high resolution. You can see down here, you zoom in, and it's pretty built out, and you can move out and away. And so kind of these are some assets that are now not only being available, sort of produced already online for you to kind of incorporate into other larger experiences, but are also easy to produce yourself without technical experience. And there's other tools, something like cospaces.io or storyspaces, which I don't have pictured here, that allow you to kind of use just within your browser and just by drag and drop objects to kind of build these semi-fully functional interactive VR experiences. So these are things that are more aimed towards non-technical users, but are improving in their ability to create fully featured environments. Another thing which is exciting is that AR and VR is increasingly supported in most browsers, and so that's specifically good for WebVR, which a year and a half ago was really impossible to work with, but today is getting much more accessible and fun. And the exciting thing about that is that people in news organizations and people who are working with interactive fiction projects already often work with web developers, normal web developers, and people who have experience with JavaScript, with HTML, but maybe not necessarily with Unity or interactive game development. WebVR is accessible because it's both in JavaScript and has an HTML-based tool called A-Frame that makes that type of development more accessible to people and for people who can learn it who've already been doing web development. And finally, there's a lot of energy around the social platform distribution, so that it's not something that necessarily has to be downloaded as an app or purchased on the Play Store, but something that could be shared on Facebook and then actually experienced on Facebook, and then could benefit from that kind of native that native inclusion that we've seen in other media, where people don't really want to leave their social network in order to consume the media that they see inside of it. So that's just something that I like to use to kind of paint a picture of the direction that some of this technology is moving. It's not necessarily here yet, and we can't just say eventually it'll work perfectly. But I think that it's something that I like to keep in mind as I start to develop BoxHop out and talk to people about it. because we're not going to be able to solve every problem with this tool, but we'd like to kind of integrate it into what people are hoping or thinking about what they'd like to do next. So this is basically very small text and in general a bad slide, but these are some of the questions that I'd like to open up to you guys about, to kind of think through what types of resources you already have when you're building interactive experiences. If you haven't built anything yet, why not? What has stopped you? And also, that can be a technical question. It can also be like, I don't think it's useful for my project. I'm kind of curious to just hear about that based on your own experience. And I'm also, I think one of the big questions is, as we figure out what features the Mediate service needs to integrate on WebVR to serve reporters and journalists and nonfiction storytellers, how can we balance flexibility with overdetermination? Because I think I mentioned something called CoSpaces, which is really just like a closed app environment where you go, you build your CoSpaces site and you send it to other people. It's always on the CoSpaces site. That's kind of limits your distribution abilities, and it kind of creates more of a sandbox environment versus something like an API, which, yeah, you can basically incorporate it in any way you see fit, but it has a much higher level of technical knowledge that's needed before you can make use of a tool like that. And then finally, like, what types of documentation would a project like this need to be helpful for people? Would they need to see examples? Would there need to be demos to then build off of? What would that look like? Is it necessary to kind of even create finished projects that demonstrate how it might be used before then going out? Would a development process that's more in collaboration around a specific project be useful? Those are kinds of the questions I'm thinking, and I'm curious to hear not just from your experience as filmmakers, but also from projects you've worked on in the past developing technical tools, as I know some of you have done. Yeah, and then we're not going to do that today. But if anybody wants to do an introduction to A-frame and we have some time left over, I can do that. But yeah, so I'm open to suggestions on how to do this, but I'd like to sort of start the discussion with everyone here, as well as show the prototype to some people. The prototype is of the Mediate service, not the WebVR version of Voxhop, but it can give you a sense of what's possible. So what do you think, Beza? Should we just chat and then people can try it out? I kind of need to explain how to use it.
I think so.
Yeah. Or like maybe I can open it up for questions. I know that was like a wordy and not very visual presentation. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the project. So the idea is that Voxhop will be a browser-based tool so that you can make a WebVR experience, include the Voxhop tool, and then the question is, what should that tool do? Right now, the tool will, the basic specifications for the tool are that it allows you to basically replicate what we have on the Mediate service in WebVR, which you can see right there. The Mediate service basically allows you to annotate an environment with your voice, and it's transcribed. And you can also, there's multiple clients can do it at the same time. So it's a way to asynchronously annotate a VR environment. So the question is, yeah.
Explain the user case though. What would that look like actually?
Yeah, so say you're my editor and I'm a reporter, and we have procured a 3D model of a crime scene. Okay, and my job is to kind of create a narrative around what happened in that environment. So I've gone into I just put on the headset, I open up our project, and it's a web page, and I move around leaving annotations like, this is the door where, the evil killer came in. I'm not a reporter. And then, and this over here in the kitchen is where, like, she tried to escape from blah, blah, blah. And then you come in and you can say, like, do we have an actual source for this on top of that animation? You can be like, actually, I talked to somebody else involved, and he said that that's not actually what happened, and that she came in over there. And then you can go over to the other door and say, and it's kind of this, like, actually collaborating to design the story in 3D space.
So it's spoken, and then it's transcribed into print, and that print appears, I see that.
For right now, that's where the print appears. That's kind of like an open question of what should the interface look like, because you can also hear it. So when you look at it and you'll hear it as well. And then there's all kinds of design questions that we don't have answers to yet. Like, for example, with the Mediate service, it's all based on, like, your gaze and where you are and where you look. For the initial prototype, that was something that you actually left with your hand. And so those are kinds of some design choices that we're not sure whether to develop through practicing with the story with an actual collaborative project, or to even determine those questions, or leave it up to people to specialize the tool for themselves. For example, we could make it possible for you to decide what action leaves voice command, whether it's something you look at or whether it's something you leave with your hand. But I think that's kind of what we're sort of interested in talking about at the first case, is like what kinds of stories do people actually want to tell in this type of environment. And I think that's something that's a bigger challenge in many ways, because a spatial story, it's easy to say like a crime scene, but like, is that even useful for people? Is it something we should do? Well, I think that one of the challenges for this project is that there are tools for 360 video and photo, and their design process is completely different. They really are geared towards, they're also very fully featured already, and it's possible to annotate them, it's possible to look at them at the same time as somebody else, but none of that data is stored in 3D environment. So it's almost a sort of different project. It's strange because on one hand, using 360 video and photographs does seem like a natural starting point, but the interaction design, the ability to share the requirements and the modalities of moving through space are completely different. So unfortunately, I haven't found those tools. I can find the names of a couple, but they exist, and I don't find them that instructive for this project. But I agree with what you said about working up from use cases, and I think that's something that is pretty important. But that's kind of an open question of like this challenge of like building a tool and then not having a use for it, but building it in response to the fact that people weren't able to make stories without it before this, is kind of like the trade-off that I think we're grappling with a little bit. Would it be helpful to just spend a couple minutes for people trying it out and kind of see how it works? Sure. I think that might be nice, yeah. So this is the version that's running in Unity right now. And just put it on, and we're gonna give you this thing. And the way it works is when you look at, you'll see these dots appear, and you can hover on them, and you'll hear basically what the person said. You can also leave your own dots by pressing and holding while you speak this center button on the remote. And then when you release, it'll finish recording. Right now, it's limited to something like 15 seconds, so don't leave a novel. This is basically the Mediate service prototype that we have here. So then the question is, what do we need to bring in from this prototype to WebVR to make it something that's accessible for non-technical reporters and useful and makes them able to tell and share cool ideas? And that's kind of the stage of the project. Do you want to give it a go? Yeah, some people have, I used this at a previous demo at BuzzFeed, and some people left kind of funny comments. So initially I'd populated with comments that were kind of like about collaborating on a story, and then there's like 100 that are not related to that at all. So
how does the annotation work? Like, is it inbuilt, the transcription?
So my collaborator Chada hooked it up to Google Transcribe. Okay, so that's what it does right now.
Accents?
You can try it out. I don't know how well it works. It works as well as Google Translate works right now. It's not customized beyond that.
That's the other
How many axes can you move on? Just you look around?
We just don't have locomotion in the demo, but you can walk around if you build in locomotion.
So you're trying to build this so eventually it could be web VR?
Yeah, so the Voxhop project is basically the web VR skin of this project, and then with additional features so that it makes it usable by a greater number of people, hopefully.
What are the obstacles with it being like this or on the web?
There's no obstacles with this version. I think that my question is more of what are the obstacles for people building these experiences, because it doesn't, has only a model because we put a model in it. That's not part of the prototype. So that's a question is like, yeah. So WebVR for Reporter, the problem would be distribution, because right now you would have a hard time getting people to look at your thing from a VR headset because it may not exist. Would you like to try it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that problem of distribution may change a lot in the next year as the phones that have AR Core and AR Kit enabled become more popular. So I guess another like broader question is also like what you have all sort of stated some interest to varying levels in VR or AR, and I'm just curious to know like what your like why? Like what you're hoping to make, why it appeals to you, or what is the problems that you see with it moving forward? Not necessarily pertaining to Voxhop or this project, Mediate. William, you mentioned like you were interested in AR. Maybe we would talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say the constraint with VR is that it always falls, it always fails in some sense because it's up against the impossible. It's up against like the immersive quality of your everyday dreams.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to, unless it's super high end, which is not for everyone. It's going to be tough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's socially isolating, blah, blah, blah. And maybe that'll change, and maybe eye trackers will permit a more responsive environment.
Mm-hmm.
AR I really like because it's participatory. People can help to annotate a space. They
Yeah.
can really bring history to it, restore it, lost spaces. It's in the world, it's social. So for, at least for my purposes, it's got a lot more.
Yeah.
And if I look at how the Times currently imagines this, it's pretty much the same way they imagined the photograph 130 years ago. Like, okay, this isn't the story, but it is like access to information the story can't really reveal. The level of detail that it's not the story itself. The story doesn't lean on the little 360s. That's just a flavor of the world that the story is about.
Yeah.
That may change, but that's about money, and that's what they don't have much of.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing about VR that makes it useful is that a lot of the technologies that will be foundational to AR are also being developed in VR. So that's something that I think is also, it may not be like one or the other kind of an environment too. But
And in terms of AR applications, so how is there like
go back to my seat.
geo-positioning, like how does that work on a location? How precise can I tag something? As precise as I can in this world? Like if I want to put a note on a street sign,
Yeah.
that should not be a problem?
I don't think it would be a problem. It depends on what software you're using. I know that you can geotag stuff pretty accurately, and then beyond that, you'd basically be you'd be creating a 3D reconstruction for your phone of that environment, and then it would be able to very accurately, just as you are going to be in an environment, using the same technologies that it would in a VR environment. Basically, it recreates a VR version of your world and then tags that version. So you'd zoom in, you'd start with the geospatial data probably to narrow down what you're looking at, and then it would reconstruct it using a 3D model, like an on-the-fly 3D modeler. So that's why I kind of don't feel like there's that much of a distinction between the two technologies, because at the end of the day, any like fine-grained AR that's not simply reliant on your GPS tag will be relying on a real-time 3D reconstruction of that environment based off of the cameras from the device that you're using.
Even in the app we developed, we used the camera sensor. Even in the app that we developed, we had used the camera sensor. Just the GPS was not enough. Especially, we created an app for people who can't see. It was at the hackathon. And essentially, it triggers AR sound. And so one of the modes is the discovery mode. So as you walk by, sounds are triggered based on GPS and camera sensing. And so, yeah, you have to rely on the camera for it to be even more accurate than, because internet speeds may also vary, and that can affect where your pin is dropped. And for people with disability, that marginal error can be fatal. So,
Yeah.
And Rick, we're speculating about games applications for this.
So two things that immediately came to mind. One is probably, you've already talked about it, but just as a collaboration environment. And really I'm thinking not as games as collaboration, but making a game with other people. And then if I'm making a VR game, being able to annotate the experience while we're debugging it or talking about it. So a big Twitter thread from a Japanese conference about Zelda Breath of the Wind. The developers brought all of their collaboration tools into the game itself. So while you're working on the game and making it, they were able to share movies and video and sketch on it and talk about it and share it. And it was all done so that if I was working on the build and somebody else came to the build, it was all, like I can bring up those annotations. There's the amount of infrastructure required for that is pretty high, and no one's going to invest in that in their game. But bringing in an outside tool, particularly like a Unity tool, might be one way a collaborative team, particularly so when I look at VR teams, they tend to be pretty spread out. Like there's people in Montreal, and there's people out on the West Coast, and like more so even than when I think about and talk to like indie game developers.
Yeah.
And then just as mechanically, like, because it might be because of the kinds of VR games and VR experiences we're looking at now, like museum style, curation style, things where I need to interpret it, and then I need to have somebody else see that interpretation. Because I'm in the headset, I might be playing it on my own, and it might be asynchronous, which I think is kind of interesting. We've seen that with AR games, like some of the stuff that you were talking about. It was the yellow arrow, yeah. That immediately came to mind, like just a VR version of that.
Yeah, so the tool, the Mediate service, I think we're aiming for release as Unity plugin in the coming months. And then the question is on top of that, like whether, that's sort of how I was thinking about it too, is almost as a tool for collaboration and for the design of a creative environment, not necessarily then for production. Yeah. But then I think that one of the things that we keep circling back to is kind of this question of like, how to actually work with reporter. Like, is that something that people are using? Like even for AR, I mean, that's a question, is like, how would you tell a story in space for like a nonfiction project that goes beyond maybe, like I think these use cases of like museum guides and things that people are already using like phones for are a little bit easier, but then there's also, I think, still an open question of like whether this tool would actually be useful.
Well, with any kind of game that has an online attachment to it, like it immediately becomes overwhelming if there's too many users using it, right? So it's not really, you can't just allow you to annotate the space, but then how do you then filter and curate the annotations themselves once they get just too overwhelming?
Yeah, that's a big like interface decision that we haven't figured out yet, because it kind of relies on what you're doing with it, you know, how to search and sort for things.
And then do you trust the user to be good when they're using it? Like with games, you don't. But in other experiences, you might. But I don't know.
Like, should they be able to talk to each other?
So like Annotation Studio comes to mind, right? I think Court Vent was working on it, where they can really scale. It could just be just the teacher or just the class or everyone in America or over the planet. I mean, I don't know what the gradients are.
I think there are like two different approaches, like one being like collaboration between authors and the other one being like open participation. And I think they're
with a comment system.
Like design-wise is different. Like I was thinking about Halsey here.
Yeah. Waiting for him to weigh in.
I was thinking about Runware, which is, you know, everyone can, like people who use it, they can comment on it, so it's open to participation, but that's using the real world, which is like, you know, infinite possibilities, and it is installing it in like, you know, really beautiful pieces, sculpture parts. Like Halsey?
Yeah.
Am I saying it right? So it's like it's really playful just because the environment is beautiful and it has a lot of creative opportunities. So in your case, that world has to be built. So I think it's a whole design decision. Like it's different for those two different cases. If you want to generate participation, you have to create a very generative, inspiring world. On the other hand, if this is for authors, it has to be geared toward whatever listener you're working on. So it sounds like two different tools, or same tool with two different branches.
Right, there's two different approaches. And I think that one of the things that, like, what this is good at is that kind of, like, it is that commenting system, but it's for the creators at this point, because there is no environment, basically, so you'd have to have an environment. But in Unity, for example, or in any 3D environment, it can be relatively simplistic to just add an audio to something. So it's not really about building the experience. It's harder to kind of create a tool, but it basically does is it allows you to add audio as a collaborative technique instead of as part of a game asset, and then manipulate it that way. So that's one of the reasons that I'm thinking about it more on the creative production side, but I think that whether to extend it for comments is like, you're right, they're totally different design decisions, and they would require different, like, I'd have to make sure.
So the VR project we're working on now is, we're still figuring out the gameplay for it, but a lot of it is, if you're inside of this 3D cell, and you're seeing a first-person view of this cell, and one of the mechanics is likely going to be using scientific techniques to stain. Like to stain, like the cell, so you can see different structures within the cell.
Okay.
And one of the issues with any kind of, like, because we're looking at educational games and games inside of classrooms, teachers, when they see VR, they want to be able to author VR content in the class. Like, they don't want to just have an experience, but they want the kids to actually make stuff. Because a lot of all the other technology work they're doing in the classroom is creating new things with the. Like, they're playing a game, but the game's also a tool. So I can see this as being that kind of, like, if this were inside the game, then maybe I'm labeling the cell, and if I'm labeling the cell with a stain, maybe I'm also saying things and adding voice comments to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's already kind of doing that with PowerPoints and other things they make in classrooms. But then also because VR is like one person, one headset, right now we're experimenting with mechanics for multiple people playing with only one person in the headset. But I can also imagine, because you're just not going to get these headsets in the classroom that easily, I can also imagine student gets out of class, goes to the lab, uses the equipment, makes their comments, comes back, another student comes in and sees those.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a living Google Doc.
Yeah,
Google
Doc is kind of the inspiration for it. Yeah.
So yeah, so if you're looking at producers, I would also take a look at, like, I don't think I also don't know what your business plan or what kind of market you're looking at, because Unity plugins are not a market. People expect them to be free.
Yeah.
It's really hard. So it's like a tool that also has a Unity plugin that has a server component. Yeah, they'll pay for that. But just a piece of software that I can get from the Unity store. So we've talked with other startups trying to do the same sort of thing. It's just really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of potential users you have are really, really small.
Yeah. That's not the business plan. Don't worry. But I mean, I think that this is also like a problem of like going too wide and trying to be everything for somebody or something for everybody versus trying to figure out what. I mean, I think that, for this particular instantiation, the question is there a reason why reporters or people working in nonfiction storytelling might ever want to tell a story in 3D space? And then the question is, does this help them, and what does it need to do to help them do that? Because I think that you're right, there are a ton of other markets, and we will explore those and talk about them. I think game development is a big one, but you're right, there are a lot of challenges in that space, and educational stuff is another big one too, that maybe we could learn from. But it's a question of, like, again, building features that work for one group of people is not necessarily going to work for the other group of people. And so I think that figuring out those specs is kind of the task of the day of like who to actually work with and what stories to tell. And I guess like an open question would be like, what if you could draw something in tilt brush, like a space or something where it happened, maybe as an eyewitness or something like that. You could sketch it out, or you could tell a sketch artist what it looked like. Would that be something where then just going through and leaving audio annotations in that space, that's less of a fully featured narrative experience, but like William said, something that you would embed into the article, it would come out, you could check it out in context and then put it away and hear that voice? Is that something more that like seems more accessible to people? More of a soundbite as opposed to like a fully featured 3D app store experience?
There are a lot of these apps which you point out an article and then it's supposed to be augmented anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're beginning there now.
Yeah.
They're really trending. So how is this going to be different from that, except that it's the 3D environment? Like how are you differentiating that environment?
So there's no differentiation because this is a tool for annotating those spaces with your voice with multiple people. So the question is like, if I've been talking to people like the Texas Observer or something that are building the AR app that just like you hold your phone up, you see the AR symbol and then suddenly press on it, like it's kind of an embed like a photo. The question is like, is that something where being able to leave a comment around that thing is useful as a commenting system, or is that sound aspect not necessary? Or is it something where, the designers are working together and they don't need remote voice collaboration on the AR object? So yeah, or is it useful at all? I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer for that.
Designing a protest movement, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how many people. Like, it's also a question of how like news portals already have websites where you leave feedback and you leave comment and voice and video, and you're already doing that. So there is a huge online journalism trend as well.
Yeah, for annotating the text. Yeah.
So how do you I'm wondering how you're going to fit in.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as an extension of that for if they start working with 3D models, 3D environments, which is the big kind of question, I guess. I think one of the questions is whether you just play things back in the order that people record them. So it's kind of like record here, wait, go over here, and then they kind of pop up and become visible on that timeline of creation. Or whether editing the timeline of those things is something that happens in the after you add them all, and then you can sort of select times for them to appear, and there's like a master timeline. or whether it's something where it's more of like a spatial thing. Like I've seen some demos where you can like sort of play the audio by moving through the space. So it's not necessarily tied to a real-time timeline, but it's tied to like as you walk, things appear as you progress.
It's a little more hybrid in the sense that it isn't that you're imposing a strict narrative so much as it is you're making content available at different times during your experience. So the stuff at the beginning could be explored non-linearly, but only the stuff that's available to you at the beginning that captures some kind of introductory aspect of your story is available in the beginning, but you can experience it any way you want, and then that stuff sort of gradually fades out. And then, maybe there's a middle section that's, you're asking about sort of, storytelling in that sense. I think there are, again, it's something I've been exploring a lot with sort of timed assets as opposed to spatial assets. And they can be both time and space assets. And sort of restricting the access to those. I certainly don't have any real solutions, but it's just I think it's a really interesting area to think about, and what you guys have is so great because there's the specificity of where things are that works really well. Being able to access the content in a very specific way in 3 dimensions and all of that is that's what VR affords you as opposed to my AR world, which is as you pointed out, it's just sort of GPS. I'm generally around here
for now. Not
for now, right? I mean, there's new GPS technology that's going to be a lot better very soon, but it's not going to help inside, right? Inside is going to continue to be a problem, but in any case.
No, but I think it's a good question, and maybe the takeaway from that is like to think about it entirely as a collaboration tool will come up against this problem again and again of people not really having the idea of what they want to build with it. So it kind of has to answer both of those questions, where it like allows you to create a narrative inside of it at the same time as it allows you to collaborate with somebody else. And so then in that respect, thinking of time is something where people should be able to both leave these comments that are persistent for their collaborators, but also be able to leave different comments that are kind of like the final story that we're going to tell in this space. And that's something that the user then sees. And that's something where providing structure around time could be, I could see how that could be really helpful for helping people think through it. Yeah. Because I do feel like I talk to people that get stuck in this like morass of like, well, I'm not gonna be able to program interactivity, or they want it to be exactly what they saw in real life. And it's kind of like, I'm not gonna spend hours like animating Unity characters. So what's kind of a lower way to do that? And I think audio can convey a lot of emotion and narrative. And I think that having just even the 3D imagery can kind of come together to create a good experience. But how to structure that, I think, is another stumbling block for people. And it's a really great suggestion. We talked earlier about like showing and giving examples or doing collaborations that do really different stuff. And I think there's some things that people, this question again of like what's helpful to tell in VR. And I think that it's an idea of like something that like makes use of that fact that it's scale agnostic to tell very detailed stories and then zoom out to like a much larger environment and navigate that environment would be a cool project that would exemplify like why you may want to use this more malleable virtual environment instead of something else. So that's something to think about, since the tool doesn't matter. Yeah.
So one thing I also just keep in mind is just the weirdness of talking with a VR headset on your face. Like, have you had this with other people? Like, have you seen people who are like really reactive against that sort of thing? Have people actually really enjoyed it and got?
So we put about 40 people in when we were gathering like the user data stuff this summer for the audio, for the natural language portion. No, people were pretty comfortable with it. One of the differences is that we basically, I think for us, that experience was basically the same as like learning to do talk aloud testing. Like some people were like, you want me to talk the whole time? Yeah. But that was more related to like they weren't used to talking constantly, and less to have to do with feeling weird about talking with the headset on.
Yeah, and I wonder if that.
But that might have been because they weren't
artificial because
in a study.
Because they're being like prompted to be like that, and they're changing their behavior for that. Because I just wonder, like, so there's I've never been a person who uses voice memos, but there are people who are.
Yeah.
And so, and are those my mental models? Those are journalists. Like my Hollywood images of, the reporter talking to them.
Well, that's where the inspiration for this project came from, was from working with reporters, and often they're sketching memos, taking notes with their voice. It's the fastest way. They can translate it later. They can also get notes from other people really quickly, and that's kind of what the idea was from, is how to bring that voice sketchy ability into VR.
Because those, so for those kind of people, those are very like, speed is of the essence, because that idea is
So the idea that they're going to set up an Alienware laptop and plug it into a VR headset and go into a corner is definitely hard to swallow.
No, but a mobile phone. But so what I'm thinking about then is like, where's that 3D environment coming from? Where do you see, like, so you're saying, you know, at some point they're going to be telling stories in 3D more often, or they're going to have these 3D environments. They're not going to have animation. But where do you see like the environments themselves coming from? Is it like we have stock photos, now we've got stock environments, or is it more like tilt brush? Because I can easily click, like, the tilt brush idea really clicks with me pretty easily. Like it's this open space, we can add things to it, pretty simple. Or even just like, you know, the Matrix white room, just throw a chair in there or something and talk about it. But I have a hard time thinking about where these stock environments.
So let me give you an example. So maybe you're somewhere, something's happening, you're a reporter, and you have a relatively new phone, which is, has anybody seen the Google Tango when it was in production? Yeah, so it basically uses like some technology to create, like we were talking earlier, it creates a 3D model of your environment. Right now you can also do it by taking like 1,000 photos with your iPhone, and then you put it into some software called Recap, and it spits out a 3D model of that space. So I could pretty easily ask you to hold still and generate like a pretty low poly and maybe glitchy model of you in like less than 2 minutes, which I could then embed in a story as a 3D model just by itself. So I guess it's a combination of these technologies, one for generating 3D models, like 123 Catch was around for a while. I mean, the photogrammetry technology is really frustrating to follow just because of like that world, and they're just keep buying companies and not selling the product anymore and buying each other and not selling the product anymore, but I can't control that. All I can say is that I think that the photogrammetry technology, the real-time 3D imaging stuff that happens inside the phone's body, things like tilt brush being more accessible, online models being more accessible, not just for like generic objects, but also for places. Many places have 3D models. Famous places exist already as 3D models. So I think that there's this weird point in time where people aren't really using those yet, and they're not really convenient yet, but maybe this is it feels like we're kind of on the cusp of this possible. Which is hard to then develop a tool. It's like, oh, it's going to be for the future. But it's just something I can't control for all of it. But I think that's kind of, the question then is like, do I have to put the thing in place to ingest those? Is that something that needs to be done on Voxhop's side for reporters to use it? Or is it something where it's just kind of like push it down the road a little bit?
Well, I mean, the iPhone X is going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, you know, soon to be released. I mean, obviously there'll be major glitches and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it does have the ability to, you know, obviously the facial recognition is the main use case for it now, but it has the technology that will be able to essentially scan, you know, like Tango, more or less. But I'm imagining that Apple's thought it through a little more fully in terms of sort of what the use cases are and all that.
Yeah, I mean, and their facial recognition stuff is for AR technology as well. So
right. And it's
Snapchat filter.
So I don't think it's that far off to be able to have a reporter go into a space and, you know, within 30 seconds scan it and then have that model.
And that's the use case, right? The idea is the reporter can scan it, annotate it while they're there on their phone. Their editor in the office can look at it, make changes, and push it out. So the ideal world is something that happens really fast, but we're not there yet. But that's kind of like, what can we build while we're getting there so that it's something that can be useful to people in that respect.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel that far off to me, to be honest.
That's good.
Maybe,
Or bad, depending on how you look at Apple.
Yeah, it's true.
Just live your horrifying news even more than you do now.
Are reporters using their video cameras?
Yeah.
Like when they're taking notes, are they actually like shooting video and commenting?
At BuzzFeed, I can't speak to any other news organization in that much detail. At BuzzFeed, the reporters are shooting video. They're often streaming their video. Yeah. They probably wouldn't shoot a one-on-one interview, but if they were in like a crowd of people, they would absolutely be shooting video. If it was something that was visual, they would shoot video. If it was just an interview, they might just write it.
In India, they've now started giving out mobile kits. Sorry? They've started giving out mobile kits. So a lot of my journalist friends, they get a selfie stick, a camera, and a little microphone attached.
Yeah.
They're not going out with cinematographers or camera persons anymore.
Yeah.
They're directly doing their streaming.
It's up to, yeah, they have to do it.
How it goes and it gets edited.
They even have like they have like an editing app in the phone they use to make basic edits to throw it up with the, they don't even send it to, unless it's like marked as like a story that gets art. Like you have most stories just go out, and then if it's a story that gets art, it gets pushed to the art desk, and then they do more to it.
Yeah, I was thinking of this as a tool to counter mainstream journalism.
Yeah.
That, I think, is really powerful as an application, because mainstream journalism has a way of giving you a finite 360 perspective. And then if you have this sound, then different, I'm thinking of, all the Dalit and people's movement, the work that is being done in India, and people would love to sort of put in different annotations of the same event in the same moment and different voices, and so I'm really looking at it as a piece for journalists who are not mainstream actually.
That's interesting.
I was kind of like I thought of it more as that sense of like kind of bringing it down to the community level and community journalism.
It will be very powerful there, because that's what we're constantly trying to do. We're trying to push back against this whole totalitarian, this is what the world looks edge to edge kind of perspective. And then if you have this tool, you can really go back to a site and leave comments. And so for people whose journalism is not BuzzFeed and not Guardian.
Yeah. It would be interesting too to kind of be able to see like if there's people that have different experiences in the same place, and you could kind of swap between their narratives of that environment.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Guys, you've given me a lot to think about. This has been very helpful.